Hey, this is Pastor Philip, and this is our devotional for this week. We're in Amos chapter 5, and I wanted to just kind of give you a history real quick of kind of how the Israelites got here and why they're heading into exile, slavery once again. Weren't they in slavery in Egypt, and didn't they rise up to be one of the greatest nations in the Middle East area? Like, they were under King Solomon. I mean, they were one of the wealthiest, most powerful nations in the world. What happened? And the answer kind of goes back to, well, before they had a king. Before they had a king, they were ruled by what we call judges. And the Israelites would have a judge that kind of held the place of a prophet in the way that they mediated between God and the people. And God actually ruled over the people. And God said, I will be your king and you will be my people. And they still messed up. They still, if you read the book of Judges, you see that they messed up over and over and over. And God redeemed them over and over and over. And then they're finally crying out. They're like, we need a king because we want to be like the other nations. In fact, in 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 22, Samuel goes through this long dissertation of why they don't need a king, why the king is going to, make their children into slaves, and why the king is going to, take all their money and all of this stuff. And they say this, but the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. I think this is a key word here for understanding what is happening, so that we can be like the other nations. You see, I think in our culture today, it's hard for us to wrap our brains around the idea of worshiping other gods. And we would never think that we should worship other gods. But in this culture, many people, you believed in everyone else's gods. So the Israelites believed in the Canaanite gods, believed in the Egyptian gods. They just believed that the one true God, our God, was above all the other gods. But they still believed that they existed. And so if you believe a God actually exists, and maybe that God could actually help you. And so what happens is when you create relationships with other nations, you start to take on the ideas of that nation. And so as they got closer and closer to the Canaanites, they began to take on the Canaanite gods and began to understand what the Canaanite gods were all about, and maybe that the Canaanite gods could help them in some way and serve them. And so needing a king also meant that they were going to, be like the other gods and serve other gods as well. And so that leads us to Solomon. Solomon in chapter 9 talks about the slave inscriptions that he took from other nations and from actual Israel itself to build the temple and war rooms and all of these things. So the King Solomon is actually doing what Samuel said the king would do. So it's kind of line by line exactly what King Solomon did was exactly what was warned against him. And then King Solomon took it a step further and had 700 plus wives and 300 plus concubines. And you may say, well, that's just a lot of wives, that's a lot of concubines. What in the world is that all about? It's all about contracts with other relationships. The way two kings would make a contract would be to marry the other king's daughter into relationship with the king that he wanted to create a contract with. And so 700 wives means 700 contracts and relationships with other nations. That's a lot of contracts. It's a lot of relationships. Just imagine the amount of political, socioeconomic pull that those contracts created. And with those different nations came more and more different gods. And so Solomon began to build temples to these gods in Jerusalem. We have temples to gods who are an abomination, that would they sacrificed children in Jerusalem because of some of these temples that were built on holy hills in Jerusalem. This is really key for where we are now, because now Judah and Israel, they've split, and the Israelite community is closer and closer, is getting closer and closer and closer to exile itself. And God's had enough. And that's why Amos is crying out. He's calling them to return. You didn't return. You didn't return. You didn't return. You were supposed to live out justice and righteousness. And now here you are. And that's the fervor that we hear. And the people are not going to choose to follow God, and they are going to find themselves in exile again, asking that question once again. And I think if you read Amos this way, it'll help you. Imagine them compiling the writings of Amos in exile and asking the question, how in the world did this happen? How did we get here? How did we go from being God's chosen people to being a people who completely disobeyed God? And I think that's something we can ask as well. How do we get here? How do we get to the place we are in the church, where we've really lost a lot of our voice in the community? How have we been hypocritical? How have we chosen power over choosing the way of Jesus? And how have those things affected the generations of Christians in the world that we live in? And so what is the answer? What is the answer to reevaluating what it means to follow after Jesus? I believe it goes back to what we talked about on Sunday when we talked about returning to God. That's the whole thing, is it's never too late. And God's loving kindness and loving mercy for the Israelites and for us is never too late. It's never too late to follow after God.